Welcome to section 1.5 Bias and Sampling. In this lesson, you should be able to explain the sources of bias in sampling. So, remember the goal of sampling is to obtain information about a population through a sample. And now that we know how to obtain samples, we must also be aware of the problems that may arise in sampling. One of the problems that may arise is the bias in sampling. So bias happens when the results of the sample are not representative of the population. In other words, bias could mean to give preference to selecting some individuals over the others. It could also mean that certain responses are more likely to occur in the sample than in the population. Here are the sources of bias in sampling: sampling bias, non-response bias, and response bias. So let's talk about sampling bias first. So sampling bias means the technique used to obtain the sample tends to favor one part of the population over another. One good example is when we use convenience sampling. If you could remember on the previous section, we mentioned that convenience sampling is not really that good strategy because the individuals are not chosen through a random sample. Another reason of sampling bias is what we call the undercoverage. Undercoverage can result when the proportion of one segment of the population is lower in a sample than it is in the population. For example, if we take a published list of all registered voters, there might be undercoverage because the list may be incomplete since people who recently registered to vote may not be on the published list of registered voters. The second one is non-response bias. So non-response bias exists when individuals selected to be in the sample who do not respond to the survey have different opinions from those who do. For example, a polling company is conducting a study in a certain city on people's attitudes toward their occupation. The company calls random phone numbers each day between the hours of 6 p.m. and 9 p.m. So non-response bias occurred in this example because those that work during the evening hours will be unable to take part of the study because of the given time frame from 6 p.m. to 9 p.m. only. Many service industries and healthcare employees work evenings. So also these members of the population may have unique views in their occupation. The third sources of bias is the response bias. So response bias exists when the answers on the survey do not reflect the true feelings of the respondent. And also response bias can occur in a number of ways: interviewer error, misrepresented answers, wording of questions, ordering of questions or words, type of question, data entry error. So let's take an example. In our town, 25% of car accidents among 18 to 20-year-olds were alcohol related. Do you support lowering the legal drinking age to 18? So, in this scenario, the researcher is leading the respondent toward the answer of no. There will be the unrepresentative number of no answers due to the approach of the researcher and the wording of the question. Another example: do you believe that women and men should receive the same pay rate for doing the same job? And let's suppose that this question was asked in a focus group. So, response bias occurred in this situation because the respondent would be hesitant to give a no answer because of social desirability concerns. The behavior of the respondent would yield an unrepresentative number of a no answer. Now, just to add here, non-response bias, response bias, and data entry errors are types of non-sampling error. So let's talk about non-sampling error versus sampling error. So non-sampling error results from obtaining and recording the information collected. In other words, it can be the result from undercoverage and other sources of bias I've mentioned. Meanwhile, sampling error result from using a subset of the population to describe characteristics of the population. In other words, it results from using a sample to estimate information about a population. It occurs because sample gives incomplete information about the population. So to summarize this section, we talked about bias in this and the sources of bias in sampling. That includes sampling bias, where when the technique used to obtain the sample is favoring one part of the population over the other. And then non-response bias, when individuals in the sample do not respond to the survey and have different feelings from those who do. And the response bias, where the answers on a survey do not reflect the true feelings of the respondents because they are scared to be honest, to admit anything, whatever. Also, response bias can occur in a number of ways, such as interviewer error, misrepresented answers, the way the question is being asked in its order, and type of question and data entry error. We also differentiated sampling error and non sampling error. Sampling error is unavoidable and comes from asking a sample instead of the whole group, while non sampling error comes from the mistakes such as undercoverage, non response bias, or data entry error. So that's it. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to familiarize yourself in the actual presentation. There you'll find additional examples and my notes. So the next video section the next video is section 1.6, which is all about design of experiments. See you then.